Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our participants to today's webinar. We are very happy to see a large number of people who have already joined us this morning, and we hope to have many more of you join us over the next 5 to 10 minutes. Uh, Today's webinar is hosted by the E Institute and is a part of the series on incubating innovation for rural electrification. Many of you who have joined us today are part of the Telecom Energy Initiative collaboration platform, which is hosted by WBI, World Bank Institute's climate change team, and is a discussion focal point for the broader community around rural electrification and private sector-led off-grid electrification. So those of you who are already on the platform and have joined us today, welcome again to this continuing conversation. Those of you who are not yet part of our broader circle of friends on the platform, we welcome you to come and join us. So we can keep having these discussions, these very pertinent discussions on finding ways to support off-grid electrification and building a bigger role for the private sector. So for just to give a very quick context on what is it that we are trying to achieve as part of this broader initiative, it's a World Bank IFC led initiative, though I'm just saying leadership in the sense of coordination and helping build collaborations. But it also has a big role of a whole lot of global organizations such as the Rockefeller Foundation and various other private sector, multilateral, and NGO sector organizations. We've been looking at ways to support the development of business models to support private sector in taking a leadership role in off-grid energy solution provision. We have had several rounds of discussions over the last 6 months, beginning with the virtual roundtable in November and a series of webinars on the platform. Those of you who are there, you have seen e-discussions taking place and several other ways of engaging, including a workshop that we recently held in Malawi. As a part of that continuing conversation, we have been looking at several specific areas of focus that seem to be emerging from all of our conversations with all of you, which include creation of positive enabling policy environments, standardization of the technical details of these off-grid solutions, um, just meeting and talking and building partnerships among ourselves. And finally, probably in some ways, one of the most important aspects is financing and finding ways to channel financial resources towards private enterprises who are willing or are interested in supporting off-grid electrification. On this topic, today we are going to be focusing more on the financing aspect of it. Uh, as many of you who have been registered for a long time, we were hoping to have Professor David Girard with us. Unfortunately, those of you who have heard of his passing, we will miss him sorely. And those are really big shoes to fill. But I think the agenda has been set for us. The path in some ways has been laid out better. And so what we need to do is to keep moving in the direction that will lead us at some point to have all of those 1.4 billion uh, people out there who do not have access to good quality electricity to have that. Uh, we are very grateful to Dr. Irving Mintzer, Senior Advisor, Potomac Asset Management Company, and Managing Director and Chief Strategist for the Potomac Energy Fund, for joining us today in this webinar to speak a little more or to share his expertise and experience uh, of channeling financial resources to support private sector-led off-grid electrification. I don't think he needs much of introduction. He's an internationally recognized expert on energy technologies. For those of you who are working on climate change issues around the energy sector, as well as overall impact on societies and natural ecosystems, you may have heard of him. Um, he's also a member of the Global Business Network, He has been involved in international negotiations related to energy, global climate change, and so forth for the last 30 years. And so you can imagine there's a very large bio, which I'm not going to read out. Instead, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Binzer and request him to walk us through some of the current thinking or the emerging thinking on financing, on channeling financial resources to the private sector for off-grid energy solutions. With that, I hand over to Dr. Minzer.
Thank you, Manali. It's a pleasure and a privilege for me to join you today in the conversation about addressing the challenges of financing off-grid rural electrification. What I'm going to share with you, in large part, is the output of a multi-sectoral dialogue sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies under the auspices of the Foundation's SPEED program, the program for smart power for economically and environmentally sound development. This brainstorming session focused primarily on issues related to stimulating private sector finance to underwrite, in particular, the high first cost of installation of these systems and to provide long-dated patient capital for the financing of conversion of both telecom towers and other focal points of energy use in rural areas. It also discussed parallel opportunities in urban areas that could meet the current challenges facing the urban poor. As I'm sure you've discussed at greater length in your earlier conversations on this subject, we together saw the key challenges as though facing the conversion of telecom towers to renewable and other clean sources of electricity, involving both regulatory uncertainty. For example, what happens to the business model of the converted cell tower when the grid is extended into the region which was previously unconnected in a rural area. In addition, there were concerns about the availability of adequate human capacity, both to staff the businesses that grow up around the telecom towers, to maintain the equipment, and to ensure adequate financial oversight and accounting support for the back office components of these businesses. There were concerns in addition about institutional competence and familiarity with these technologies on the part of local financial institutions who, as you'll see in our proposed framework for addressing these challenges, play a key role. And finally, there were additional concerns about the soundness of the business models, how to ensure that the enterprises that take on the provision of clean, renewable electricity to cell phone towers can maintain themselves as a going concern, continue to be creditworthy, and to act as an engine for rural economic growth. In the interest of truth in advertising, I should tell you, in addition, that the intellectual inspiration for the framework that I'm going to share with you came entirely from the participants in this meeting. The errors or misstatements about how it might work are entirely my own. With that, let me tell you the purpose of the conversation we held 2 weeks ago and how I think it relates to what you're trying to do here. We saw the principal purpose of this effort, that is the conversion of cell towers and other loci of energy demand in rural areas of developing countries, as a vehicle for engaging public and international resources to support the modernization of these facilities, particularly in rural areas, in order to achieve two objectives. The first being to reduce the financial and environmental costs, particularly the greenhouse gas emissions, associated with bringing electricity for these critically important communications purposes, and as well to develop a mechanism that can generate and then capture a development dividend by providing electricity for the productive sector in areas immediately surrounding these cell towers. We were particularly excited about the possibility of developing financial models that can provide enough economic rent both to sustain the ESCOs or private sector entities that are providing the energy services to the cell towers, and also to provide additional electricity for use by those in the immediate surrounding area, other small businesses, small and medium scale enterprises, and in addition to provide potentially some energy for community service purposes, lighting in schools, refrigeration in clinics, that can help to stimulate economic growth in the immediate surrounding area. We see, therefore, the conversion of the cell towers not just as the possibility of creating a new business opportunity, but rather making these existing loci of electricity demand a potentially vigorous actor in stimulating economic development in the immediate surrounding area, and thus generating even larger demand for electricity and other commercial energy forms. With that introduction, I'm going to ask you to turn your attention to the following slide, which I'm going to walk you through. It represents a framework by which we think it might be possible to unleash billions of dollars of private sector capital for the purpose of underwriting energy development around cell towers and other loci of growth in developing countries. Can we see the slide? Okay, so the slide should now be on your screen, titled Figure 1, Closing the Loop on Financing for Resilient and Sustainable Infrastructure. In the view of the participants, this slide illustrates the fact that we think the development of these enterprises can be broken down into 3 periods which have very different risk-reward profiles. The period of greatest risk occurs during the innovation and proof of concept phase, where the opportunity is faced, the challenge is faced for generating new business models, innovative business arrangements, and most importantly, bankable project proposals that can attract both debt and equity capital to these small and medium-sized enterprises that will provide electricity services to telecoms towers and other loci of growth. If I could draw your attention to the left part of this slide, I'll walk you through our thinking about how this process might work. The key to this is, of course, the instigation of mechanisms for reinforcing existing capacity in developing countries to convert good ideas to bankable projects. We think this will require a project development facility, perhaps along the lines that's been laid out by the Asian Development Bank. Could be an existing or a new entity that is set up specifically for the purpose of aiding local project sponsors and project developers to prepare bankable proposals. The process of enhancing and reinforcing existing capacity and making it possible for these entities to develop clearly defined, well-stated, thoughtfully articulated, and bankable proposals is going to require an investment of human capital, which in many cases, not all, is hard to aggregate in rural areas of developing countries. Was our belief that the cost of this project development activity is likely to require some measure of grant financing, which might be provided by multilateral development banks, rural development banks, bilaterals, foundations, or private sector enterprises that have interest in the development of these loci of rural economic growth. But in order to ensure that all of the participants are fully engaged and committed to the activity, we would suggest that only 80% of the cost of this project development process be financed through grants to be provided by a project development facility, and 20% would have to reflect the capital engagement of local or national developers, who together would generate the bankable project proposal that you see outlined in the lower left corner of this figure. This bankable project proposal would be passed to a new national entity, a sustainable development, what we have called a Sustainable Development B Corporation, that takes on the role of evaluation, assessment, and selection of proposals that can indeed both advance national development priorities and create self-sustaining business entities that can proceed in a profitable fashion to act over a multi-decadal period. That's the blue box, the role of the blue box in the middle, labeled Sustainable Development B Corporation. This Sustainable Development B Corporation is likely to take on different forms in different countries. In each country, in collaboration with national government authorities, this entity will have to be shaped with an appropriate legal structure for the jurisdiction in which it evolves. It will need help. In particular, it needs help in order to generate the capital for short-term construction loans to finance the conversion of telecoms towers or other loci of economic growth in rural areas. We would suggest that at least in the beginning of this period of pilot and replication, ODA, or domestic budget resources, be provided as a first loss cash reserve to the venture capital that will be sought from national governments, local organizations, philanthropic activities, or ODA projects that will underwrite this first phase of development of the Sustainable Development B Corporation. With this capital in hand, following the selection of bankable proposals that meet rigid criteria for business performance as well as for engineering capability, the Sustainable Development B Corporation will initiate a loan to the project developer that will be paid back when the project begins routine operations and the provision of service. So this is a short-term revolving fund where the loan duration is typically 18 months to 2 years at most. The innovation here is that the Sustainable Development B Corporation, as you see in the lower right-hand corner, will play a second role as the projects move into the least risk period of routine operations and normal business activity. In that period, the Sustainable Development B Corporation will act as an aggregator of capital drawn from sovereign wealth funds and other private sector sources, loaned to the B Corporation for purposes of the financial takeout of the short-term construction loans. At this point, the national government, local organization, philanthropic party, or ODA that provided the short-term construction financing will be paid back from the Sustainable Development B Corporation out of the funds it has raised from these sources of patient capital. The Sustainable Development B Corporation, depending on the size of the individual loans, will primarily serve the function of aggregating loans into portfolios that can then be either whose risk profile has been mitigated by both geographic diversification and diversification of project implementing authorities, can be either passed back to the sovereign wealth funds or sold in the secondary capital markets for the purposes of reimbursing the sovereign wealth funds. In this case, the sovereign wealth funds act as the purveyor of long-term patient capital brought into the rural electrification process only in the period of least risk, when the enterprises are up and going concerns, when their business model has been verified through both the rigorous review of the Sustainable Development B Corporation, the completion of construction, and the initiation of routine operations. In this way, we think it's possible to create a secondary market for investments in rural electrification and to bring forward the uh, long-term patient capital flows that are now sitting in sovereign wealth funds and other private sector capital providers. With that, I'd like to open up the conversation to questions and see if we can have a vigorous exchange for the remainder of the hour. Perhaps we can start with a question raised by Dean Cooper. I'm going to read it to you because you may not all be able to see it. We, UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, are about to kick off a mini-grids program in developing countries, aiming to demonstrate the commercial viability of operation and so develop bankable concepts to address your most risk stage of development with a view to attracting private investment. A key question is what scale of electrification will be viable. We're starting at 5,000 people or 2 megawatts, but we'd like to then take this experience and look at 100 kilowatts to 2 megawatts. Do you think this smaller scale can be economically and commercially viable? What are the key factors that must be addressed? Well, let me just say to start with, I definitely think that scales smaller than 2 megawatts can be commercially viable. The trick, I think, is going to be in the process of aggregation. What makes small projects most difficult to finance is the high transaction costs associated with finding the financing for individual project activities. It's for that reason that our colleagues at Bellagio concluded that there was a need for something like a nationally organized Sustainable Development B Corporation that would aggregate dozens or even hundreds of small-scale projects into potentially into networks operated by a single entity, but more importantly into portfolios that could diversify the risk and would allow financing to be acquired in larger increments than could be possible if one were doing projects of the, say, 5 to 10 kilowatt scale. In many cases, it just won't be realistic to try to build a 2 megawatt facility around a telecom tower in a rural area. There isn't that much reliable demand. There certainly is demand beyond the 2 to 10 kilowatts that the cell tower itself will require. We believe that perhaps starting at the individual project level by doubling the need for power at the telecom tower to, say, 20 kilowatts, you can begin to build out the base of the productive sector in the immediate surrounding area and over time increase the local demand at this energy hub from 20 to 50 kilowatts. The key innovation, however, is allowing the Sustainable Development B Corporation to aggregate these 20 kilowatt projects into clusters, geographically diversified, that reflect a variety of business enterprises that will actually manage the operations, and that taken together have the creditworthiness to acquire significantly greater capital and at a much lower transaction cost. I'd turn to the next question I'm going to take is from Simon. Will the facility focus on mini grids only or also on solar home systems and other related products? So our initial thinking was that these small energy hubs built around telecom towers would use the telecom towers as anchor tenants, but would provide a small amount of excess electricity that could be used to support small and medium-sized enterprises in the immediate surrounding area of the telecom tower, and that could also provide some public service energy either for village lighting, for refrigeration at a local clinic, for lighting at schools. It would be easy to expand this model to include solar home systems, but that was not our original thinking. I'll take a question from Justin at the Sierra Club. Do you have interest from sovereign wealth funds to serve the purpose outlined? Yes, indeed we do. We've had some feedback from an emerging aggregation of sovereign wealth funds and national pension funds that met recently in Hong Kong, indicating that they would like to be a part of a shared undertaking to move this model to a practical level. What does that say?
Facility.
On the facility
Loans.
loans. Okay, so yes, there's a question from Sanjit Malik. Is there a rate of return expected on the facility loans? We did not try to specify a target rate of return for the loans from the sovereign wealth funds to the Sustainable Development B Corporation. We would expect that because of the public service purpose of this undertaking, that the capital would be made available with an expectation of rates of return that are significantly below market. What that will depend in part on the willingness of the sovereign wealth funds and its inclination to support the broader development aims of this undertaking, as well as its fiduciary responsibility to make a return on its funds. Siddharth had asked, how do you convince leaders about the long-term viability of the projects? Well, the key to that, I think, is not different from any other business enterprise. There has to be a rigorous and stringent set of criteria applied to the analysis of each of these business plans. There has to be a plausible and well-developed mechanism for ensuring that the businesses will be a going concern if the financing, both equity and debt, is made available. And there has to be a built-in mechanism for periodic reassessment to ensure that the local developers are getting the level of support that they need from national and local authorities to make their enterprises successful going concerns. Pep at the IFC has asked, is there a sufficient pipeline of bankable projects? And as the answer is simple as we speak, no. This model has not been implemented. We're currently under discussions with, as I said, a coalition of sovereign wealth funds and national pension funds, and have begun discussions through the United Nations with a number of national political leaders about their willingness to support and take on the national and local responsibilities that are pivotal to bringing this kind of model to bear in their jurisdictions. John Leo asks, have commercial banks been involved in the discussion? Not in a formal way. There were a number of representatives in this recent conversation of Bellagio who represent private sector capital providers, but we've not approached any private commercial banks about participating as patient lenders in the support of the Sustainable Development B corporations. What do you want? Who do you want to look at? Justin Gay. This is a response from Justin Gray of the Sierra Club. We've heard from companies like OMC that the majority of their revenue comes from the community power side, not the tower power side. However, to secure capital, banks require the tower as an anchor tenant. How do you see organizations successfully demonstrating the financial viability on the community power side in order to unlock capital for non-tower based operations and help unlock capital more widely? That's an excellent question. I don't have a satisfactory answer, I'm afraid. Justin, I think what it will take is actually demonstration on the ground that the non-anchor tenant-based revenue is secure and reasonably reliable. Initially, I think we're going to have to rely on the creditworthiness of the tower as the anchor tenant, and only after actual operating experience has shown that the small and medium scale enterprises can, and I believe will, make regular payments for the electricity that allows their activities to be electrified, only then will we have the basis in practical experience to argue to banks that this portion of the business model is also, quote, bankable, unquote. Ted Hester has asked, assuming 3 to 6 year paybacks, how do you mitigate the risk of grid extension? Well, grid extension is not per se a financial problem. So I think what will be required is establishing a sense of ownership in this vehicle with political and regulatory authorities in the country so that the initial early period of penetration is insulated from grid extension as a possible competitor to local site-based self-generation and local rural development based on these energy hubs. This model only works in collaboration, first of all and most importantly, with local enterprises and the ability to develop a sense of empowerment and local ownership. But nearly as important is the establishment of a coalition of interest and a shared commitment to the validity of this model with national authorities. And so we would not suggest taking this model initially into countries that are 98% electrified, and you're trying to electrify the 2% of the country where the only available electricity comes from the telecom towers. Instead, we would recommend taking this into a country like Malawi or others where electrification is at the below 10% level, and where, with judicious engagement of national authorities, one might realistically believe that there were other targets of opportunity for rural electrification than in the small number of initial towers that were electrified with renewable energy under this program. You got something for me? So Kieran Stopforth of the Bloomberg New Energy Finance Group asks, how does this fit into the current landscape of off-grid finance? Is anyone doing this already? Is it just a question of linking different groups up? Do sustainable development B corporations exist? The short answer is no, no, and no in that order. No one is currently mounting a financial model that closes the loop in the way that has been outlined here. There are similar, well-developed, thoughtfully planned initiatives addressing each part of this puzzle, and there's a real opportunity, we think, to create synergisms among them, connecting them around this framework. We hope to encourage the participation of regional and multilateral development banks that are already at work, for example, supporting project development facilities. It's not just the Asian Development Bank that's engaged in this way. We think that there are similar but significantly different structures that are attempting to take on parts of the role outlined here for the Sustainable Development B Corporation. We think there's an opportunity to build on these entities, to share knowledge among them, and to expand their mandate as described here. And as I mentioned earlier, there's an interest on the part of sovereign wealth funds to participate in the process. But the unique innovation here is the idea of closing the loop, building the strength of this enterprise around the relationship with local development organizations and with nationally driven entities that we've called Sustainable Development B Corporations. Ilham Talab asks, how do we solve the problem with fee collection or ability to pay, which is a unique characteristic of each mini-grid business model? When you propose to aggregate these projects for financing, how can these specifications be addressed? Well, Ilham, that goes back to the question that we addressed earlier of why not branch out immediately to solar home systems? The advantage of building the business model around the existing telecom energy hub is that the creditworthiness and reliability of payment of the telecom towers is well established. Their business only succeeds if they have a reliable source of electricity. I would argue from a technical standpoint that the hybrid systems that we're discussing here that will join solar, wind, or biomass-fired electricity to the existing diesel genset backup and battery backup is significantly more reliable and provides a better quality of service to those towers. And the towers themselves represent the kind of high quality, credit-worthy counterparty that banks can relate to. So as long as the business model is built initially around this level of high quality, credit-worthy counterparty, and only begins to expand outward on the basis of demonstrating the ability to source other streams of revenue successfully, I think will allow us to address the fee collection and ability to pay problem that you put your finger on. So Monica asks, you're speaking about towers, but can the portfolio be diversified to other sectors? In principle, yes. There's no reason why a hospital or a clinic can't be similarly viewed as a credit-worthy anchor tenant. It requires evaluating the specific business proposition associated with each hospital or clinic network. But the idea here is simple and not limited to telecom towers. If you have a baseload demand that requires electricity that is currently being met, in this case, by diesel-generated power at 40 to 60 cents a kilowatt hour, and you have a reliable and credit-worthy party, you can use the credit experience with that party as a platform to build out this engine of local economic development. It's a little bit more complicated in the case of hospitals, but not overwhelmingly so. My own reaction and that of many of the participants at Bellagio would be to start simple, start small, demonstrate the model, and then build out from there. So Ted Hester has a second question, this one about a question about a low IRR in high-risk regions. Most money in developing countries is looking for 25 to 30% IRR and short periods of payback, as opposed to a modest 5 to 7% over a longer period of time that would be associated with rural microgrid projects. Why would sovereign wealth funds or other large pools of private capital invest when there are so many more high-yielding opportunities elsewhere in developing economies? Well, let me just say, Ted, that for investors who are looking for returns of the sort that have been achieved by those who bought Google stock at the IPO, this is not a good proposition. The principal driving factor for engaging in this type of capital structure is not a quick return and a large payback. This is what we've tried to develop here is an articulated multi-phase structure that allows a patient investor to achieve a high degree of security on a long-dated return that has substantial development benefits. It's only going to be attractive for investors who have an allocation in their portfolio that fits that risk-return profile. It's not good for everybody. I wouldn't recommend it for widows and orphans, but I do think that there is a significant pool of private capital available that does fit this risk-reward profile, backstopped in the ways that we've just described. Yasser asks, in your opinion, what kind of business models could work in places where electricity is largely subsidized by governments? So in areas that are served by existing grids, this model is not applicable. And those are the areas in which governments typically provide electricity subsidies. In countries where governments are already providing electricity subsidies for rural electrification, either providing diesel at low cost for rural electrification, as occurs in some parts of South America, this is not a good model. But in places where the bulk of the 1.4 billion people who live in unelectrified areas live, this proposal has some potential to achieve traction. Please understand, This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. This is not a panacea. This will not solve all of the really hard development challenges that face the World Bank and IFC and the bilaterals and national governments. This is an attempt to address one small sliver of the problem, the sliver of the problem that it meets the needs of those of the 1.4 billion people without electricity who are currently living in the dark and charging their cell phones from car batteries. We think that in those areas, this particular approach has a potential, creates a potential opportunity for serving the bottom of the pyramid that can be replicated, that can provide reasonable returns that are relatively secure, and which deliver significant development dividends. Who do you want? Siddharth? Siddharth asks, does your model factor in any policy support for the first two phases besides the capital? Because in the absence of both policy and regulatory support, this model could lead developers to charging arbitrary tariffs to the rural population. Well, without, as I said before, without cooperation and collaboration on the part of national governments in the policy sector, this model and any other rural electrification scheme is hopelessly destined to failure. Yes, policy support is needed. In some cases, as we discussed before, there may need to be efforts made by policymakers at the national level to insulate the areas that are currently high-value potential targets for early penetration from the next round of grid connection, allow them to become established, and in addition to protecting the developers from grid interconnection, quite frankly, there have to be standards set for what are reasonable tariffs to charge. This business model will not work unless the cost of electricity delivered to the user, whether it's the anchor tenant of the telecom tower or the local business, is significantly less than the alternative of diesel-generated electricity. If you feel that what is currently being charged to telecom towers as the cost of diesel-fired generation and backup of 40 cents per kilowatt hour is usurious, I think you have a case to be made, and you should make it with telecom towers. But I think that we can ensure that absurdly high tariffs are not charged to local businesses in this process by elaborating a measure of coordination with national policymakers. Gianleo Frisari, given the skill set required with the tasks entrusted to the Sustainable Development B Corp, financial acumen, risk management experience, brokerage networks, etc., wouldn't it be simpler to have regional or national development banks do this? Have you tried with them already? Is any of them willing to take up the role? Well, Gianleo, you're absolutely right. The level of financial acumen, of risk management capability, and of access to capital is much higher in the regional and national development banks than in any of the local organizations that we have contacted in our initial process. And they could do this using other vehicles and have had that opportunity for the last several decades. The reason that we feel a commitment is necessary to a national sustainable development B corporation structure is that we think this model only works if there is a robust level of commitment, political buy-in, and shared ownership with both national authorities and, more importantly, with the local developers who will be responsible for making these projects a going concern. Yes, others could do it. I hope they will. It is not. There is no intention here to create a monopolistic control over the rural electrification process. I hope there are 1,000 alternative models put in place and that 990 of them all prove out. But in the meantime, we think this is one possible way to go forward, and we wish all the others good luck. Dean Cooper, will this model be relevant for the clean energy hybridization of existing diesel-powered mini-grids? You stressed the bottom of the tiered focus and energy access, which is also a longer-term target for us. But our first target is to improve the environmental context. This still involves high capital costs that are not affordable to communities who can generally not access bank loans, for example, island communities in Asia. Well, Dean, my answer to that is yes and no. Um, uh, it is possible to adapt this model for upgrading the quality of energy that's provided through areas that are already served by diesel generators with battery backup for other purposes. We'd be happy to talk to you about how this model could work in island communities, which are similarly paying very high costs for electricity. We hope to start with telecom towers as anchor tenants and use it as a platform for expanding energy access to the rural poor. But clearly, there are other lower risk applications, including the ones you've described, where the model could be modified to address local needs. We'd be happy to discuss those. Justin? Here's a second question from Justin Gay. I'm not sure if I've seen this question yet. Are you concerned with efforts in a couple of Indian states, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, to regulate off-grid tariffs by capping the rate that can be charged to surrounding communities? I'm not concerned by that. I would hope that in these states and in other places, a dialogue with regional regulatory authorities would allow them to recognize that in some cases, opportunities to provide electricity at below market costs could still be attractive, even if those prices are higher than the on-grid connected coal-fired electricity that's available in other parts of the state. Who would you like? Diam Nagpal, what sort of risks are imposed by regulatory frameworks existing now, considering that some of the mini-grids will scale in terms of capacity and customers served as the surrounding communities move up the energy consumption curve? I think the primary risk of scaling mini-grids is building the business acumen of the ESCO or other local enterprise that is providing the management expertise to guide this. Often a small enterprise that can be successful at a limited scale doesn't always have the capacity to build out the management system, the information and knowledge management capability that are needed to scale up the enterprise. So in order for this model to scale as mini-grid scale, one of the key components will be human and institutional capacity building for the local enterprises that are managing these mini-grids. It's not knowing how to do it at 2 kilowatts or 10 kilowatts doesn't mean you know how to do it at 2 megawatts or 10 megawatts. So the key component to this, and in fact more important than the financing, is the human capacity building and the institutional reinforcement of existing entities in these countries to make sure that the human competence to serve the needs of the rural poor expands as their demand for energy moves up the energy consumption curve. Gungor Kara, from our current field test in East Africa, Gungor says, we have made the experience that the people have money available to buy their own solar home systems. Products are available from various producers, but available is limited to working capital constraint. Would a financial model which consists of decentralized working capital budget for solar home system producers and distributors and telco tower not be the perfect solution so we could achieve infrastructure growth and initiate a jumpstart in decentralized power generation? Yes, that's a good idea. I don't think it's necessary to link up the solar home system and the telecom tower models initially together, and the reason is that the question raised earlier about creditworthiness and credibility of the repayment system for the solar home component of the investment. As long as you can generate a similar risk profile and an assessment of the creditworthiness of the individual consumers who are buying the solar home systems, then linking them up isn't a problem. But in the interim, I think we have to look simultaneously for other models that would provide working capital and indeed investment capital for the spread of solar home systems in East Africa and elsewhere. Who would you like next? The red question. Excuse me for a second while we find the red question.
Just scroll up.
Mateo de la Vota asks, you talked about a potential growth in power demand that follows the creation of mini-grids in rural areas and goes beyond the simple demand from the telecom facilities. How can you shape the size of your power plant taking this additional growth into account? In other words, are you aware of reliable models or statistics that can help to solve the sizing issue? Yes, I think we can do that. The advantage of initial reliance on solar, wind, or biomass as the generating equipment for this model is the fundamental modularity of those systems and the ability to increase size by replicating a small but efficient configuration. The key to that, of course, is the design of the power management system that controls power transmission between the generating unit, whether it be wind or solar or a biomass-fired generator, the battery, and the transfer case that distributes the power either directly to the telecom application or off the immediate site to the surrounding demands. I don't think that this is a showstopper in any sense. It's an interesting engineering challenge, but one that is amenable to solution and for which there are several available solutions in the market. Who would you like next?
China.
Rohit Nag asks, for countries like China where you have 99% electricity, but the 1% live in very remote, hard-to-reach areas where biogas is the only option, what would be a workable model? Well, China's a special case, but a very important special case. I think this model could work. In this case, the role that is being currently envisioned to be provided by the Sovereign Wealth Fund in the green box with dashed lines in the right-hand column, as well as in the yellow box in the middle column, could be played by existing financial institutions in China, perhaps by the China Development Bank, in some cases by the China Investment Corp. The key, of course, is being able to create whatever the correct name for the local analog of a regional sustainable development B Corp would be. There's no problem scaling the use of biomass, and in some of the rural areas of China, for example, in the western Xinjiang province, there are large wind resources, so it might be possible to make the generative power for the electrification come from small local wind that powered the telecom towers. I think the key in each case is to understand what are the local conditions in terms of the physical and natural resources that are available, the demand and creditworthiness of that demand at the local site, and the business environment and consumption patterns of the local community. I can't emphasize enough that unless there is an emphasis placed on shared ownership and buy-in by the local community, this model doesn't work. Unless the entire enterprise is driven from the bottom by a dedication to meeting the needs of that local community, the rest is just hand-waving. So I think there is an opportunity for that in China. The details of where the money comes from and how it flows will be unique to the unique cultural characteristics of the Chinese state. but I do think the model can apply. Tobias? Anjali Garg asks, how should the global community address the issues around quality, health, and safety standard as distributed grids mushroom all over the world? This is a key issue. Well, I hope that there will someday be globally accepted standards for power quality, health, and safety. I'm sorry to have to say that I don't think that's happening this week. In the meantime, I think we need to encourage the development of those standards at a national level and the provision of guidelines by the regional and multilateral development banks and bilateral development assistance organizations that are supporting this type of demand-driven, development-first based investment. The key here is that the focus has to be on development first, and that means attending to the social impacts, to the health and environmental consequences of those investments. Otherwise, why bother? Should we take one more question?
Yeah, let's take the last one.
Which one is that? Anupam? So Anupam Jain asks, looks like the inclination is more on top-down approaches. However, they either take very long or are difficult to do where governments are not too supportive. Regulations are not very friendly or processes take too much time. Do you think bottom-up approaches like solar home systems, solar lanterns, or small microgrids are more encouraging here? Okay, so this is an issue of some prejudice. I will share my prejudice with you. It is not fact. I believe that there is a role for both top-down and bottom-up approaches. The advantage of using a top-down approach to financing is that through the aggregation of large numbers of small projects, you can minimize the transaction cost that's typically associated with bringing the very large flows of capital that are necessary to bear. On the other hand, bottom-up approaches are necessary to ensure ownership of the activity both at the local level and at the national level. I'm going to have to stop here, and all I can say is thank you for this very invigorating conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Minter, for this great presentation. Would like to thank the 80 participants that were very active in the discussion today for this webinar. All questions might not have been addressed, so we'd like to invite you to join our Collaboration for Development platform, where the debate can be taken forward and where you will be able to download the presentation and view the recording of the webinar at a later time. Once again, thanks to all for participating in this webinar. Thanks to Dr. Minter, and have a great day.